Hey, it's Tom here and welcome back to the channel. So in this video we're going to take a look at some of my favorite investors and the recent updates that we got around their current portfolio holdings. If you don't know already, every single quarter investors in the US managing more than $100 million have to fill out something called a 13F form or 13F filing, and that tells us all of the positions that they own in the US. So we can really use this as a nice way to sort of source investment ideas and get interesting stocks to kind of look at for our own investment portfolios. So just like every quarter on the channel, I will be going through some of the usual culprits with investors like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and Mohnish, Pabrai and Spier, and I'll also add in a newer investor that is kind of maybe a lesser known person to follow, but someone who has phenomenal returns and I think is an interesting person to track as well. So that is the topic of today's video, but before we get into that, we do have a sponsor, and today's sponsor is Hatch. Now, Hatch have been my personal broker of choice for me as a Kiwi, buying all of my US shares for more than a couple of years at this point. I initially switched across to Hatch purely to save on fees. I was paying $90 a trade with one of the big banks for investment kind of trades that I can now do for $3 in Hatch. So they've been a lifesaver when it comes to fees, and they've also continued to improve the platform and add features like kids accounts, which just launched in 2021. So you can now set up investment accounts for your kids to get the snowball rolling really early and start compounding investments with even lower fees than the traditional Hatch accounts. A second shout out to Hatch in this video actually for their contribution to my Movember campaign as well. They very kindly donated some money to that cause as well. So much appreciated, Hatch. If you're interested in checking out Hatch at all, you'll need to go to the link hatch.as/investingwithtom. If you go to that link, start a new Hatch account and deposit 100 New Zealand dollars into that account, Hatch will give you a free $20 top up so that you can get started investing with a little bit more money. Now, before we get into these 13F updates, just as usual, there's kind of a couple of things to keep in mind when we look at these Superinvestor portfolios. Firstly, this is only going to show us any US investments. It's not going to show us any international investments. Luckily, we do have an interesting kind of tool called Ticker, which I've been using recently as well. That will give us actually some of the international holdings, anything where the investor in question has had to file some sort of regulatory filing internationally. So if they buy 5% of the total shares outstanding of a Japanese corporation, for example, like Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway did maybe a year or so ago, we'll be able to pick up those things as well, but it's still an incomplete picture and we won't quite be able to pick up everything. It also won't show us any cash holdings or any short positions that the investor might have as well. So those are a few things just to keep in mind, but for now let's get straight into it and start off with the big dog, Warren Buffett. Okay, so Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, as has been the case for the last few quarters at this point, had very little activity in the third quarter of 2021. So if I haven't mentioned it already, this is data up to the end of September 2021. It's not as of today or anything like that. There is a bit of a delay on getting this data, but as of the end of September, there was basically no change in the top 7 positions at Berkshire. So for Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, the top positions remain Apple, Bank of America, American Express, Coca-Cola, Kraft Heinz, Moody's, and Verizon. But as we start working our way down and looking at some of the smaller investments, we did see a very small change, or about a 1% kind of trim in US Bancorp. We saw about a 19% sale in Charter Communications, and we saw about a 24% addition to Chevron. If we keep working our way down the portfolio, again, there's no massive changes here, but it was interesting to see that Berkshire actually trimmed 2 of their credit card company holdings. So there was no change to American Express, which is quite a large position for Berkshire, but there was a slight reduction in Visa, about a 4% reduction in Visa, and also a 6% reduction in MasterCard. Beyond that, we continued to see Berkshire trim some of their pharmaceutical investments. So we saw a 29% reduction in AbbVie, and we saw a 16% reduction in Bristol Myers Squibb. And as we get into some of the really small positions in the portfolio, and when I say really small, we're talking like less than 0.5% of the portfolio at this point, we did see a few changes. So typically at kind of the bottom end of the portfolio, these are more likely to be Todd Combs and Ted Weschler investments, which are 2 of the money managers that work under Warren Buffett. So in that kind of smaller end of the portfolio, we saw a 35% increase in Liberty Sirius XM Group Series A, which is sort of one of this complex network of John Malone investments. John Malone being known as the cable cowboy, if you've ever read up on him. So we saw a 35% increase there. We also saw a brand new holding, which again is very small. It only represents about 0.16% of the portfolio, but that was in a company called Royalty Pharma. We saw a 34% reduction in Marsh & McLennan. We saw another brand new stock, again, very, very small. We're talking 0.03% of the portfolio now, which is Floor & Decor Holdings, Inc. Something in my head just kind of tells me this is almost certainly a Ted or Todd investment. I know that at least one of those two had a quite successful investment in 2020 in RH, which is another kind of furniture company. So I suspect that's kind of squarely in the circle of competence for one of those two guys. And finally, we had 3 stocks at Berkshire which were completely sold out of. None of these 3 were large positions by any means. The biggest one was 0.24% of the portfolio, and the other 2 were 0.02% of the portfolio. So very small positions in the grand scheme for Berkshire. But those 3 stocks that were completely sold were Merck & Co. We also had Organon & Co., which is not a stock I'm familiar with at all, to be honest with you. And another one of the sort of John Malone network of companies, which was Liberty Global PLC Class C. So very little to write home about with Berkshire in terms of their 13F update. If we jump over to ticker and have a look at some of their international filings, again, there's basically nothing to write home about. So back in the start of 2021, we saw them take a very small position, and again, I'm talking 0.02% of Berkshire's stock portfolio here, in an Italian insurance company. So that still shows up here in ticker, along with the Japanese trading companies that they purchased in about August of 2020, but we have absolutely no kind of recent changes in international positions for Berkshire. Okay, so jumping across now to Charlie Munger and the Daily Journal Corporation. Now, this is a 13F that we actually got very, very early. I think Charlie Munger kind of just occasionally makes one really big trade and then kind of sits on his backside, sometimes for 10 years. So he does tend to publish these 13F filings kind of early. He doesn't wait right up till the due date. So we had actually already seen this one a little while back, and it was interesting to see that Charlie Munger actually added to his Alibaba position. So if we look at the current portfolio for the Daily Journal Corporation, at least in their 13F filing in the US, we see Bank of America represents about 40% or so of the portfolio. Wells Fargo is about 30% or so. We see Alibaba is now up to almost 20% of the portfolio, so that increased in share count 82% during the third quarter, so a big increase in Alibaba. We also see US Bancorp, which is about 3% of the portfolio, and POSCO, which is far less than 1% of the portfolio. Now, it's worth keeping in mind with the Daily Journal Corporation that they certainly do have international stocks. They are too small for any international filings to show up on a site like Ticker, but Charlie Munger has said in Daily Journal Corporation meetings before that they do have quite a big position in the Chinese EV company BYD, for example. So the percentages that we're seeing in their 13F filing here in terms of, Alibaba being a 19 or 20% position, for example, that's probably overstating the weightings in the portfolio a little bit. So that's something also to keep in mind. Okay, next up, let's jump over to one of my favorite investors, Mohnish Pabrai. Now, if we look at Mohnish Pabrai's 13F filing, this one came out a couple of days ago, and I'm sure some of you have already seen the news in terms of what Mohnish has done in that portfolio. He only has 3 US holdings at the moment, so those are Micron Technologies, Seritage Growth Properties, and Alibaba as well. So Alibaba, of course, is a Chinese company, predominantly at least, but they have a US listing, so we do get to see that here. Micron, we had a very small change, so that was added to about 1%, kind of an unusual move, I would say, for Mohnish to do, but probably not a huge amount to read into there with Micron, an increase of 1%. We saw absolutely no change in Seritage Growth Properties, so he continues to hold Seritage, represents about 30% at least of the US holdings, and we saw a massive reduction actually in Alibaba. So the share count for Alibaba in Mohnish's portfolio was down 77%. Now, there's been a lot of speculation going around about why Mohnish may have sold his Alibaba position, particularly after only buying it in the first and second quarter of 2021. It's kind of a strange move to quickly turn around and start unloading Alibaba. there's a few reasons maybe he's done it, and we won't know for certain unless Mohnish probably comes out and tells us. I suspect we will probably see that position fully exited next quarter. It would be very uncharacteristic for Mohnish to change his mind on a stock and then only sell half out of it or 80% out of it, or something like that. So I expect this may get fully sold down, but we really don't know exactly why Mohnish may have done that. Maybe he found something more interesting to buy outside of the US. Maybe it's some sort of tax loss harvesting strategy. It's really, really difficult for us to tell why he may have done this. And what is even more interesting actually is if we jump over to Ticker and look at some of Mohnish Pabrai's international holdings, we actually see quite a lot of activity here as well. And again, this is largely from a selling perspective. So there are quite a few international holdings showing up here for Mohnish Pabrai, and he has sold a lot of them, and he sold a lot of them quite recently. So we see in October, he sold about 70% of his position in Nice Holdings Co., which is a Korean financial business, I believe. He has added actually about 28% to Edelweiss Financial Services. That was done at the end of September. We also see that he sold about 70% of his position in the Indian commodity company Rain Industries. That was at the end of September. And he also trimmed about 14% of his Shinnikin Group investment as well, which is a Japanese real estate business. That was done also in September. And we do see some other moves show up in Ticker here around his Turkish investment in Racist Logistics and also in Indian Energy Exchange. But both of those positions were modified earlier in the year in the case of Racist Logistics, and actually back in 2020 in the case of Indian Energy Exchange. So really tough to kind of know exactly what Mohnish is up to here. I know his big sale on Rain Industries will come with a lot of probably capital gains tax, so perhaps he's trying to offset that with some stocks that are down. I don't quite know, but nonetheless, that will continue to be an interesting investor to follow over the next couple of quarters. Okay, so next on the list we have Guy Spier, the master of doing nothing when it comes to kind of just managing his investments. He sees his job oftentimes is just to buy great businesses and sit back and let the compounding do its thing and try to minimize frictional costs of brokerage and capital gains tax and so on. So if we look at Guy Spier's 13F, we see literally no change in anything. So just to run through maybe the top 5 positions for Guy Spier, we have Berkshire Hathaway, American Express, Bank of America, MasterCard, and Ferrari. So those remain the top 5 positions for Guy Spier, and we see absolutely no change in any of them. And I will just briefly mention Guy Spier's Alibaba position as well, because it's been a very hot kind of stock to talk about recently. So I guess we have Charlie Munger buying Alibaba in this quarter, we have Mohnish Pabrai selling it, and we have Guy Spier continuing to hold it. So we sort of have 3 different actions from 3 different investors on the same stock there. Alibaba last quarter was about 5% of the portfolio for Guy Spier's, at least US holdings. It's down to about 3.5%, but he hasn't actually changed any of the shares that he owns. He hasn't bought or sold or anything. It's just that the price of Alibaba relative to the other stocks, especially in his portfolio, has come down, so that weighting has shrunk a little bit. And again, if we jump over to Ticker and look at some of the international holdings for Guy Spier, there's only 2 stocks actually that show up here that aren't in his 13F. Those are iTech AB and also Indian Energy Exchange, just like we saw in Pabrai's portfolio. We saw no change to either of those 2 stocks, but interestingly, and I did a video on this already earlier this week, we did actually see Guy Spier come out in a recent interview with CNBC Pro and mention that he's recently invested in Prosus. So that's an example of a stock where it's not going to show up in any sort of regulatory filing. It's not a US position, and he's not a big enough investor in Prosus to warrant any other international filing. So that's one that's just worth noting as well, that won't show up in here, and we won't really be able to see it if he sells Prosus either. But that's also a recent addition to the portfolio for Guy. Okay, so next on the list here we have Li Lu at Himalaya Capital. If you don't know already, Li Lu is one of the money managers for Charlie Munger back here. It's the only fund manager that Munger has ever put money with, and we did see one change in the portfolio for Li Lu, and that was interestingly a brand new position in Berkshire Hathaway, of all things. So Li Lu has typically had a lot of his portfolio in China, and I'm sure he still does. We'll see some of that in Ticker in a sec, but he's slowly been adding to his US holdings over the last maybe year or so. So if we look through the biggest positions, we have Micron, which represents about 38% of the portfolio in the US, really big US position for Li Lu. We have Bank of America, we have Berkshire, which is now an 11% position, kind of right off the bat, those Berkshire B shares in there. We also have Google, Facebook, Apple, and Pinduoduo. So all of those other positions have just been held, no purchases, no sales for Li Lu, but he has added that new Berkshire position. And if we jump over to ticker, the only international stock that we see for Li Lu here, or the only non-US holding, is BYD. This is a monstrous position for Li Lu. That Micron stake that I mentioned before, which is I think in the high 30% range of his US portfolio. If you start to include this big BYD position, that shrinks all the way down to about a 19 or 20% position. So in here, in ticker, we're seeing that BYD is 50% of the pie. It's about a $2.1 billion position, and he has steadily been selling that down. So the latest date we've got here is from the 7th of November, so a very recent filing actually, and he's recently sold about 13% of the shares in BYD. Okay, and the last 13F that I want to talk about here is one that I have talked about on the channel before, but it's not sort of a regular appearing 13F on the YouTube channel. And that is from CAS Investment Partners, which is the fund of Cliff Sosin. Now, if you don't know already, Cliff Sosin is a very concentrated kind of value investor, just like a lot of the people that I've been talking about in this video. And he's had one of the best track records I've ever seen over the last 10 years. I think he's been compounding at roughly 30% or so per year. I'll try and put the exact track record kind of numbers up on the screen here. And a lot of that performance has been explained by just a couple of stocks, or one really, which is Carvana, which has gone up a lot. It's currently a 47.5% position for Cliff Sosin's fund, and he's a really interesting investor that I like to follow. He's got kind of a mix of high flyer, high multiple, high growth type stocks like Carvana, and he's also got some really kind of beaten up and low multiple stocks like Party City, for example. And this quarter, Cliff Sosin actually did have quite a few changes, and this isn't something that we've really seen recently. The core holdings for Cliff Sosin have remained pretty similar over the past several quarters. We've seen him add a little bit to most of these stocks actually over the past couple of quarters, and we've seen him make kind of adjustments around the edges, but we haven't seen a lot of changes in the actual stocks kind of in the portfolio. But this quarter we did. So if we start from the top, we see Carvana is still the biggest position, no change at all in shares there. We see Cardlytics was increased about 14%. Probably the most notable change here is a brand new position, which is actually in HGV, Hilton Grand Vacations, represents now about 13.5% of the portfolio. No change at all in World Acceptance Corp. We saw a 50% increase in Herbalife. No change in Party City, and we saw Cliff Sosin completely sell out of the At Home Group. And if we jump over to ticker for Cliff Sosin and CAS Investment Partners, we see the exact same holdings, so there's no international stock showing up for Cliff Sosin. Okay, so there you have it. That is our latest quarter of 13F filings, and where the portfolios currently sit for some of my favorite investors. If you think there's anything I may have missed from some big investors making moves out there in the last few months, definitely let me know down in the comments below as well. And if you're interested in checking out the Hatch offer, you'll need to go to the link hatch.as/investingwithtom. But that's it from me for this one, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.